Welcome to another issue of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine matters of interest to the entire Guyanese nation, the diaspora, and Guyanese living in the country, with a view to determining how best we could make life better for all of the Guyanese people. And we want to make recommendations. We want to look forward to the future to see how things can be made better. Sometimes we have to look back to the past, and today we'll be looking at the past, at a major event in the past, because unless we overcome the problem of the past, we will not be able to tackle the challenges of the future. And today we note that 59 years ago, there was a very serious event with the explosion on board a passenger launch called the Sun Chapman on the 6th of July, 1964. And it was a terrorist attack. And we don't want to jump to conclusions and make simplistic analyses. We want to understand that this particular event introduced political violence on a wide scale, and it damaged social cohesion very deeply in Guyana. And I think the last 59 years have been affected by the events of 6th of July 1964. It was not a rash act of anger. It was calculated, it was callous, it was cold-blooded, it was evil. And it remains the most horrific crime in a year of horrific crimes. It certainly was the most gruesome terrorist attack since the abolition of slavery in 1838, and that's no exaggeration. It's unmatched in Guyanese history for the contempt for human life. The Sun Chapman launch was bombed on a trip from Georgetown to Mackenzie on the Demerara River. 4 children were killed, and a pregnant woman who gorily gave birth spontaneously as she fell into the water. And these were among 53 common folk, working people, who were killed in that terrorist attack. We need to look, my friends, at the causes. We need to analyze what really happened. This massacre was not simplistically, I'm not criticizing other commentators, but it was not simply part of a race war. And I think we must understand that, of course, there was an ethnic dimension, but we must also look at the other dimensions. The explosion of the terrorist attack occurred during what is called the disturbances. And in this program, I would like to look at the terrorist attack at 4 levels. First, at the local or domestic struggle for political primacy, which involved not only parties, but involved the trade unions, which were fighting for supremacy in the industrial front. And that struggle was fueled by the rhetoric on the extreme left from the People's Progressive Party and on the extreme right by the United Force. And this was a time when bundles of propaganda were being brought into the country, some from the communist states and some from the capitalist states. And we need to look at it from that dimension to start with. Secondly, we need to look at the terrorism event as a part of the struggle for independence, because this was a time of decolonization. And one of the factors was who would be in the seat of power when Guyana became independent. The third level is at the international level, the geopolitical level. This was a time when there was a fierce struggle between East and West, between communist and capitalist countries. There was a struggle for the hearts and minds of these new developing states in the third world. There was a Cold War brewing. Well, not brewing, it was a Cold War was being waged. And at the fourth level, which I would like to examine briefly this morning. This is not an academic treatise, it's a discussion. And at the fourth level, we want to look at what happened down in the villages, at the grassroots level, at the communal level, at the neighborhood level. So you can see from this broad description, we have to look at the national struggle that was taking place. We have to look at the demand for independence. We have to look at the international struggle between the communist and capitalist states, and we have to look at the struggle that was taking place in the village, where people actually died. Most of them innocent, most of them hardworking, ordinary people. Now, let us look first at the political system. The PPP, the People's Progressive Party, deliberately employed terror to protest or to prevent the replacement of the first past the post system with a proportional representation system. I don't need to go into too much detail, but the first past the post system is one in which the candidate who gains the majority in a constituency would win that entire constituency. Whether he or she gets an overall majority, 50 or 60%, even if he gets 40%, but no other candidate gets a greater percentage, he or she would win that constituency. The result was that up to the elections in 1961, the People's Progressive Party was able to win, for example, about 42% of the seats in of the vote, 42% of the People's National Congress and the United Force together were able to get 58% of the votes in the popular electorate and win 42% of the seats. Well, many people felt it was unfair, and they wanted to introduce a proportional representation system, which meant that if you got 52% of the votes, you'd get 52% of the seats. And that is the system we still have today, more or less. The political leaders of the three main political parties at that time, the People's Progressive Party, the People's National Congress, and the United Force, actually signed on the dotted line, signed an agreement authorizing the British government to resolve the dispute among the three of them. And this was done in October 1963 in London. That is the year before the disturbances, this terrorist attack. The United Kingdom, the British government, imposed the PR system, and they felt that the election should be held before independence. Well, this upset the PPP at both levels. One, the PPP wanted to go into elections, into independence, without new elections. And two, the PPP wanted to retain the old first past the post system, rather than change to the PR system. This meant that the People's Progressive Party as a whole was opposed to the imposition by the British government. What happened, therefore, after the PPP leaders returned to Guyana at the beginning of 1964, a campaign of domestic terrorism was launched. And the words used by the mastermind of that campaign was a hurricane of protests. These are not my words. The words are there in the books, the Western Trial, hurricane of protests. And the campaign was launched under the pretext of the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union strike, GAWU. It's still called GAWU, although the actual words have changed. It was then GUIANA, Guyana Agricultural Workers. Now it's called Guyana Agriculture and General Workers Union. And that strike was used as a pretext to oppose the imposition of the PR system. Well, GAWU, then as now, was an affiliate of the People's Progressive Party. And the pretext it used was to demand recognition by the Sugar Producers Association. Well, this seems very far-fetched. The Sugar Producers Association PR system. It could be very confusing for people now who don't understand what was taking place. But the GAWU was not a recognized union. The recognized union was the Manpower Citizens Association, which was headed by a person who was affiliated with United Force. And he was also the president of the British Guiana Trade Union Council, Congress. So you start to see that it was a very complex matter. So when the PPP called this hurricane of protest, GAWU struck against the sugar producers or in order to claim recognition, which it did not have. And this led to the fact that many of the workers naturally were already registered members of the MPCA, the Manpower Citizens Association, which was GAWU's main rival. So they continued to work because their union did not tell them to strike. And as they went to work, they were attacked by GAWU persons who were really running an illegal strike because it wasn't recognized and the strike was not recognized. And the murder started. Now, the strike was called in February, and from March 1964, the murder started. And the murders continued to escalate throughout the GAWU strike. And by late in the year, it was from the police report, there were at least 176 murders, mostly ordinary workers. And in 165 days, the strike lasted 165 days, and there were 176 murders. So the rate of killing during the GAWU strike in 1964 between February and about July was about at least one person a day, one worker a day. That is what was taking place. Ordinary people were being killed. The second level of analysis I would like to raise with you in this program is the question of terror, revolutionary terror. The PPP calls itself, I think up to the present time, it certainly called itself in the 30 or 40 years ago, a Leninist party. Well, of course, Leninist party comes from a man called Vladimir Lenin. He's the intellectual author of what is called Leninism. But when you read about this Vladimir Lenin, read what he says about terrorism. And let me quote Lenin, verbatim. This is what he wrote. We need the real nationwide terror, which reinvigorates the country. Nationwide terror, that's what he calls for. And secondly, he said, surely you do not imagine that we shall be victorious without applying the most cruel revolutionary terror. So revolutionary terror was seen as a legitimate tool of Leninist parties to achieve power. And when you understand that a party that calls itself Leninist will embrace this philosophy of using the most cruel revolutionary means to secure power, you can understand what was taking place in Guyana 60 years ago. Therefore, my friends, at the international level, the PPP's posture was to align itself strategically with other Leninist parties, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. And they tried to portray this hurricane of protests as an anti-colonial struggle, not an anti-Sugar Producers Association struggle, an anti-PNC struggle, anti-United Force struggle. It was an anti-colonial struggle because this was the age of decolonization when other countries were becoming independent. And they aligned themselves, they associated themselves with other revolutionary movements. But when you look at the map of the Western Hemisphere, you see where these revolutionary movements were located. For example, in Cuba, there was something called the 26th of July movement, which goes by the code name M267, movement of 26th of July, 267. And that came to power in Cuba in 1959. And at that time, the so-called revolutionary government assisted other revolutionary movements in the Western Hemisphere. So after that M267 movement was victorious in Cuba, there's a movement in Guatemala, and it is called the Revolutionary Movement of 13 November, MR13. And this was fighting since 1960. So this was the international climate that the PPP was, launched its hurricane of protest. Then in Nicaragua, the Sandinista Front for National Liberation, the FSLN, in 1961. In Venezuela, the Movement of the Revolutionary Left, MIR, in 1960. In Colombia, the National Liberation Army, the ELN. If you read the history of Colombia, even now there's something called the ELN, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, the National Liberation Army, still fighting since 1964. So when you look at the map of Central America and the northern coast of South America, you'd see revolutionary movements, and United States perceive these revolutionary Leninist movements as being supported by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But nowadays there's no USSR. It is now abolished. The main geographical element is Russia. But in those days, it was the USSR, the Union of Socialist Republic, Soviet Socialist Republic. So the United States saw these movements as being a threat to the stability and the security of the entire Western Hemisphere. And the USA responded in the manner you'd expect. So it was the Cold War, and you had this geopolitical confrontation between East and West, between the capitalists and the communists, between the USSR mainly and the USA on that hand. So when the PPP launched this protest, this hurricane of protests, and when some of its supporters proclaimed, an ideology of Leninism, you can see the United States government was alarmed. And certainly they wanted to make sure their team won. So we had evidence of financial and other forms of support for the PPP by the Soviet bloc. And we had evidence of support for the United Force by the Western countries, in the form of the AFL-CIO and so on, AIF-LD, CIO and so on. And they supported the trade union organization, which was under the leadership of a major supporter of the United Force. So it was not really a clash between the PPP and the PNC. It was basically a clash between the PPP and the United Force, which was supported not purely by Portuguese, as some people think, but it was supported by businessmen from of other ethnic groups. But that is not the issue today. The issue is what happened at Hurudaya. So, my friends, we come to the situation in which the so-called British Ghana Revolution was launched in January 1964 as a campaign of organized terror. And it mobilized terrorists. This is not peaceful pickets. These were trained terrorists who received money and weapons. And the PPP's youth called the PYO, at that time was a force to reckon with. And they mobilized the stormtroopers who led the battle in this hurricane of protests. And let me quote from a document of that period. In 1962 alone, at least 110 members of the PYO were sent off to communist countries for training. More than 200, at least, more than 200 at least, are known to have gone to Cuba altogether. Training schools were established in British Guiana. And afterwards, we learned that from some of the young people who had gone there and had become disaffected and disenchanted, that they were sent by the PPP for military training, including the making of bombs and training in sabotage, with the aim of fomenting terror in Guyana and imposing communism. That is what the graduates of that training school were able to say, that they were being trained in bomb making and terrorism in order to impose communism. They're going to have their revolution here, just like Nicaragua, Colombia, Venezuela, and Cuba, and Guatemala, and so on. What happened in 1964 after the violence started, after the murder started in March? The PPP Minister of Home Affairs resigned on the 1st of June, 1964, in the wake of a grave atrocity which occurred on the 24th and 25th of May at Bismarck, Upper Demerara River. So it didn't occur on the 26th of May, as some people try to. It occurred on the 24th of May in response to or in retaliation against an event in another part of the country, which she resigned on the 1st of June after the Bismarck atrocity in which 2 persons were killed. And at that time, therefore, she relinquished responsibility for public security. She is no longer Minister of Home Affairs. And this was just before 2 of the worst massacres in the entire period of the disturbances. Within 1 week, the week after she resigned, the Abraham family, 8 members of the Abraham family, who were assumed to be associated with the United Force, were burned to death. Right here in Georgetown, in the middle of Georgetown. 8 members of the family were burned to death. The week after the PPP Minister of Home Affairs resigned. The next month, that Abraham family massacre occurred in June. The next month, on the 6th of July, 1964, we then had the Hordaya massacre. You see the sequence of events? The Minister of Home Affairs resigns. Then there's a massacre of the Abraham family, in which 8 people were killed. And then the next month in July, there's a massacre at Hordaya, in which 53 people were killed. Well, people quote different numbers, but it's about 53 persons were killed in all. And this happened after the minister resigned. And as you know, the governor, because at that time, the Guyana was still a colony, and the British governor, Sir Richard Late, imposed a state of emergency. In fact, Guyana became independent. We're still under state of emergency. And directly the morning after the Abraham fire, 32 members of the People's Progressive Party were arrested and detained without trial in Mazaruni at a special part of it called Sibley Hall. And 3 members of the PNC were detained. So 10 times as many members of the PNC were detained as a result of the disturbances in the wake of the Abraham fire. So we go on, therefore, now to the next level of analysis. What were the consequences at the communal level of what was taking place in the disturbances? The People's Progressive Party, after the early murders in the Sugar Belt, March, May, extended their terror into the villages, even villages that were not affected, that were not part of the Sugar Belt. They were not affected by the violence. Villages which were at peace, communities which previously coexisted hospitably were turned into hostile territory almost overnight. The British Army had been deployed in British Guiana since 1953. In fact, about 18 regiments of the British Army were stationed here. And at the time of the Hurdaya massacre, I think the regiment here was the Devon and Dorset Regiment. So Guyana was effectively on the British Army occupation for about 13 years, from 1953 to 1966. In fact, at the night of independence, the British Army was still here. During the so-called hurricane of protest, the PPP hurricane of protest, over 1,400 houses were burnt by arson. Thousands of hectares of sugarcane were burnt by arson. Over 5,000 persons were displaced from their normal homes, and at least 176 persons were killed. That is the butcher's bill that had to be, paid for as a result of disturbances. Displacement, murder, arson. We now face, my friends, after 1964, the aftermath. It is my view, and of course the sociologists and the political scientists can give their views. This is just my view, that the violence of 1964 has had a lasting secondary impact, not the primary impact about death and of the murders and the funerals, and the mourning, but the secondary impact which affected the children of the victim, which affected people who witnessed these murders for such a long period of time, from January to December. As I said in previous programs, violence is not a social necessity. It's a choice. It's a human invention. And it is usually the means used by one group to dominate another. And the violence that we saw in Guyana in 1964 has had a lasting impact up to 2023. The PPP's campaign, which was launched in January 1964, the beginning of the year, to prevent the PR elections, to demand immediate independence without elections, and to make the country ungovernable, failed. By December 1964, it failed. And Guyanese were able to go to the polls in December 1964. And the majority of people elected the PNC and UF parties to rule them under the PR system. And the PR system is essentially what we're still using today, nearly 60 years later. It is therefore, in light of all of these events, that the PPP was removed from office in December 1964, and peace was restored to Guyana. No more Marxism-Leninism, no more revolution, no more terrorism in the countryside. Independence came to Guyana peacefully in May 1966. Where do we go from here? The PPP administration today, I recommend, should pursue a new path by encouraging real social cohesion, so that we could promote cooperation within. No more domination, no more capturing strongholds, but we must promote a society based on cooperation rather than confrontation. We must reduce inequalities. We must respect other groups so that everyone, everywhere in Guyana could enjoy a good life. That is my hope for Guyanese people and our nation as we go forward to mark the 60th anniversary next year of the horrific hurricane of protests and the Koreatown massacre. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Each man must do his